Hello, welcome back. I'm very, very happy to have Dr. Airdre Grant with me today, and I'll put on gallery view so we can see each other nicely in the recording. There we go. So it was great to talk to you the other day, and we both felt we had a lot more to talk about at this time. And one of the things that came up was talking about grief. You're a bit of an expert in grief, aren't you?
Well, I don't know if I'm any more of an expert than anyone else, but you reach a certain age and your griefs start piling on as people start peeling off let me phrase it more. Yes, I know about grief, but no more than anyone else. But I was thinking about death, but actually there's a million different kinds of grief. I mean, just take a divorce or a miscarriage or the death of a pet, and I don't know, the loss of your hair, the loss of I've got a friend who had a great singing voice and she had an operation, she couldn't sing anymore. So grief turns up everywhere. And remember that lovely expression.
Often that's a really big grief and sometimes shame reaction as well.
With what? Sorry?
People are made redundant or lose their job.
Oh yeah, and then they feel ashamed.
Yeah.
And because your value and your worth is measured by your working life, and so if you don't have that clear identity, you can feel strange. When I moved from Sydney to North New South Wales, when I was in Sydney, I was the director of studies at Nature Care Natural Therapies College, and then when I came up north with my husband, I didn't have a job and I didn't have an identity, and I was just introduced. I remember going to events. He was at the university, going to events at the university, and they'd say, "Oh, here's Hans's wife." I didn't even have a name.
Wow.
And then people would say, "What do you do?" as they do. And I'd say, "Oh, I'm home with the children." And they'd say, "Oh, that's nice." And they'd move along. And I just felt it really disconcerting. And I grieved the loss of a status that I was actually quite happy to leave behind, but I had a loss of identity in that regard. Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've been saying frequently, particularly near the beginning of this COVID journey roller coaster we've all been on, that it seemed like a lot of initial reactions, and I know, look, I don't know what your take is, but I know there is a lot of critique about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, but I still find it a useful framework to refer to. But definitely we saw a lot of denial and bargaining. We certainly saw anger and flatness and depression and some kind of acceptance that's going on. How do you feel about that model of grief?
I think it's excellent. Just as long as everyone remembers it's not done in an orderly fashion, and you can go up and down the list, in and out. You can reach one point and then you're back to the beginning again.
That's right. It's not necessarily
nothing orderly.
And you don't tick it off and say, "Well, I was angry yesterday. I've got through that now."
No, and so you might have lost. Suppose a woman had a miscarriage, and then her life proceeds on, and then 10 years later she sees a little baby, and she revisits the grief of her lost baby. So there's no timeline, or not Western model, one after another timeline.
And May is Mother's Day month. I mean, the advertising starts, and whether you're not a mother yourself and that's a grief, or you've lost your mother, or you're sorry. I've got to say, I don't like that when we talk about death, talking about loss. It's kind of like I've mislaid them somewhere. My mother has died, and I often find for many, many years while my mother was living, I lived in a different part of the world to her, so I felt really disconnected from the Mother's Day carnival that can sometimes go on in this country. So there are lots of little triggers, but we actually have something else in common apart from our Kiwiness and general sense of humour. Is unfortunately we are members of the Dead Sibling Club. We both have brothers who've unexpectedly died. And you wrote a really touching memoir about your journey.
I did. He was my twin, and he died alone. Oh, see, I'll start crying. He died on his own in his house because he had an undiagnosed stomach ulcer, and he was on his own, and it burst, and he died, and he wasn't found. And I was in another country. He was in Wellington. I was over here. it was terrible. So what I did, I mean, I went through about a million trillion different things, but I went to the funeral, and on the way back from the funeral, I was on that Trans-Tasman plane that you've been on many times, kind of like a big bus. And I said to the woman sitting, I was in one of those 3-seat aisles, and there was me and a gap in her. And I said to her, look, you just have to excuse me if I weep, because I've just come from my twin's funeral. And she said, I'm a twin. And I went, what? So I still revisit that feeling. But anyway, she carried me across the Tasman's complete stranger. And she advised me to go to the Island of Iona, which is in Scotland, which is a sacred island, holy island. And I did. I went there. It wasn't easy. It's not an easy place to get to. But I went there, and I went there on my own. I invited people to come with me. No one would come with me, but I went there, and I wrote a book about that journey all the way to the sacred island and back again, and how that, I don't know, how that was for me, and how I felt propelled to do the journey by the gift of the stranger on the plane. But also I was ashamed of how I couldn't get over my sorrows. And I couldn't, I felt people got tired of me. So I went to hide in the world where I didn't know anyone. And I fled as far away as I could, because I felt I'd exhausted. I probably hadn't, but I felt I'd exhausted everyone. People reach a stage where they're like, buck up, you've had enough.
There's a real use by date for grief, I feel, in our culture, in our very repressed, Anglo-Saxon Celtic culture, that I kind of find that first 6 weeks people are there for you, and in my experience 6 weeks is really only the beginning of the dark tunnel, that you've got distractions and you're crying, but then you go into that long tunnel of grief, and people disappear sometimes, and occasionally, if it's 6 months or a year later and people can see you're upset, they may have said, oh, aren't you over that yet?
Yes.
Well, you weren't that close to him anyway, were you? Some ridiculous things.
No, so I don't know. But people will say that we don't talk about death in our culture. I think we talk about it all the time. If you just have a look at some of the T-shirts down the street, they're all skulls and, skeletons riding motorbikes. We're obsessed by death. But so to say that we're not concerned about death, and we pretend it's not happening, it's not true. Look at all the imagery. It's all to do with ghoulishness and death. Think of zombies. Crikey.
Yeah, there's the rise of the cult of the zombie movies.
So,
it's really interesting through COVID, and we're seeing those images of the island off New York, where the paupers generally buried anyway, and now they're just housing people in these mass graves. We've seen images from Italy and from Wuhan, but we're a little bit sheltered from it in Australia, aren't we?
I think we are, or maybe I am. I don't know. It's not affecting me in my immediate vicinity, unless I watch the news avidly, which I've learned I did in the beginning, but I've actually stopped because it wasn't helping. But I'll just back to something about the timeline of grief. I have a friend here called Judy Arpiner, who's what they call a death doula. You know how your birth doula, she's a death doula, and she helps people with the passage of death and the ceremonies and rituals around it and so forth. And she says that it takes about 2 years to come back to your senses. That's her thing. And she also says that when people behave angrily around death, like they fight over a vase, that's she gave it to me, no, she gave it to me, and then a fight might erupt in a family. She says that's not anger, that's grief.
Yeah,
it's grief, and that's a better way to understand it. And so those horrible, hideous fights over a favorite ashtray are about people not having a place to put the maelstrom of feelings that are surging around their heads. I spoke to someone this week because there's a story I referenced in my book about a young man who was in a car with 4 of his mates over near where I live on the coast in Lennox Head, and he was 19, and they were out being stupid in a car, like about a million other I mean, any one of us possibly has been stupid in a car from time to time. Anyway, he overtook another car and there was a crash and all the boys except him died. And so it upset the community tremendously. And that happened 10 years ago. And I met someone this week who said that one of the mothers of one of the boys who died still wants to punish the driver, who, of course, he went to jail at the age of 19 and he had, he suffered greatly. And we all know he didn't mean to do it.
Yeah.
But she sometimes that happens with grief. You hold on to it so hard. It's my grief.
Yeah.
And in fact, in a way, you'll only put it down when you're ready and not before. And no amount of coaching or coaxing or instructing or analysis or anything can shift that. It's
almost like a disloyalty if you let it go, or that fear that we perceived as not loving that person enough. Or it's a very complex but quite common reaction. That something, and when you talked about family members arguing over a vase, it's that symbolic of a piece of that person who has died that takes on a whole new meaning.
Yes, I really wanted my father's picnic cups, those stackable metal cups, and they went to someone else. And I still sometimes think to myself, I wanted those cups. They were mine. I wanted the cups, but they disappeared. But they meant a lot to me because of him, and they're just cups. So it's funny.
So apart from your heroic kind of Odyssean kind of journey, what else, anything that you'd recommend to people who are struggling at the moment for any kind of loss? What's helped you in your grief?
Well, it sounds anodyne in a way, but in fact, I mean, there are obvious things like being in nature, and I found going to the wild places for me really helped. But eventually it's time. I have written another book, which is offered a publisher now, because I revisited that trip. And I went back to Scotland, to some of the places, and I've talked about what grief looks like after a period of time, because you never actually lose your grief, but me anyway, it stops being sort of raw and hurtful, and it's something that you learn to live with, or possibly not. But so I've written about that too. But again, I had to go, and this is my particular source of solace. I like the wild places. I went to standing stones and black sand beaches and wild remote places and just stood there. And I must say, there was no magnificent epiphany. The sky didn't open with, a great beneficence on me and a deep understanding. I just sat there really, and then when I came home again. But I felt better when I got back, because I had reintegrated, perhaps is the way I put myself back together. You know that Japanese art form called kintsugi?
Yes, yeah.
Where they put the gold in the cracks, because the cracks, it's like that Leonard Cohen song, the crack is where the light gets in. Yeah. There's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. The cracks and the scars and the woundings are actually what make you more beautiful.
Well, actually, I wrote an article about that on my website in my cancer series, which is how I see my scar and the kintsugi of it. And it is healing the cracks with gold. It is trying to find meaning and purpose in a life-changing experience. So I can certainly relate to that.
So with the cancer, did you find that there was grief about loss of your femininity or your female self or your fertile female or your sexual self or something?
Well, because it catapulted me into menopause as well. So there were many griefs. There was, I'm a health practitioner and I have cancer. How the hell did this happen? Actually, it was endometriosis that caused that. That's my message out there. That increases your chance of ovarian cancer. So it was that. I kind of walked out of my clinic in Melbourne one day and never walked back in to see clients again, because this all happened just as I was about to announce that in 6 months' time I was moving to Sydney. There was grief of going through I mean, I was in training for menopause. I wasn't there yet, but I started working with a personal trainer. I was doing all the right things. And it's like, you know, my beautiful transition into menopause got stolen from me through, you know, radical surgery. But there was also, you know, who am I? You know, this is my persona as this type of practitioner. I live in Melbourne, but now I live in Sydney. There's things that are incomplete. So it was a lot of different griefs that happened at that time, which don't neatly just, I mean, cancer was the catalyst, but I suppose that, I mean, the tough thing is that, you know, we're going to run out of time, but, you know, the real, in a way, in a totally different way to experiencing my brother's death. I was 30, he was 33, and he was diagnosed with a brain tumor and died 3 weeks later.
Oh my!
So that was all that sudden shock stuff as well. Even though I was with him for every day of that and most of the nights. I went a bit off track there. So that was a different type of grief to. Yes, it should have made me aware of my immortality, but actually having a cancer myself, and an ovarian cancer has a very poor survival rate of 40-something%. I think we might have got up to 46% in Australia. That to actually think, well, this could kill me, and what I thought was I was very versed with in, you know, previous study of Buddhism and various other things was that, you know, I thought I was okay with impermanence, but and I've talked to other women with cancer, and they say a very similar thing. It's as if that thin veil between yourself and impermanence gets whipped away, and you see it very clearly, and it becomes very real.
That lovely saying, grief is the price we pay for love.
That's right. And yeah, it is.
You can't have one without the other, and that's what gives weighting and depth.
Yeah.
I mean, I can speak about it relatively sort of sagely now, but when I'm a rocky self, I'm not so good, because the paining and the hurting is extreme for everyone. And actually also there's no measurement. Like, no one's grief is bigger than anyone else. Like, someone says, oh, you had cancer, well, I lost my dog, and you'll go, well, who cares about your dog? I had cancer. But to them, the dog is what drives them.
And there's not a hierarchy of grief either. That, you know, if you had a parent who passed away easily in their sleep of a, you know, sudden aneurysm at 92 versus, you know, your child, that, yes, some things feel more tragic than the other, but your grief is your grief.
Your grief's your grief.
Yeah.
And you can't be hurried up, and you can't do it in an orderly fashion. And you can't be tidied up either. Well, I couldn't. I mean, sometimes people like to tidy you up.
Time. It takes it, and it's like, I think when you have an intellectual understanding of the grief process, it's almost like you think that you can kind of trick yourself through it. You can kind of over-intellectualize it. But my experience was that just slows things down. It just kind of gives you a little bit of protection between yourself and your grief, a little bit of space. It's going to come and bite you on the bottom, whether it's now or whether it's 30 years' time. You can't outrun it unless... No,
you can't. You can tidy it and you can push it away. You can push it away for as long as it'll still be there waiting for you. It's still there.
So if we can kind of think of a way to kind of wrap this up, about this time when people are grieving many things, maybe grieving a loss of their job, they may be grieving
loss of community, loss of money, loss of
status, loss of someone close or not close to them, or people are still dying of other things right now, as usual. And it's made even more difficult by not necessarily having a funeral and a wake as we would usually plan to. So you think of anything, so what we're both saying is that grief is complicated, grief takes time. There is a tunnel of grief, and I suppose the thing I would add to that was what I particularly remember with grieving my brother was, although that was uncharted waters and it was so bleak and it was so horrible, I didn't want to live at times, that there was something in me that just keeps saying, you're going to see the light again.
Yeah.
that vitality, that life spirit of yourself. And even if you go through phases of doubting it, that most of us do see the light.
Eventually. I even today I went and bought a little candle to light, to have in my living room, just to kind of speak to sad sorrows and losses, because I thought, I need a ritual which is about this tumultuous changing time. And my grief is like, well, it's not major, but I'm not seeing my family, I'm not seeing my new grandchild, and I wish I could. So I thought, instead of just consoling myself with wine, I might light a candle. I might console myself with wine. It's possible that this may happen, but I will light a candle and be grateful. It's really quite hard, and it's hard not to be all butterflies and rainbows, but because I find, those gratitude journals, I find them difficult to sustain. I can be grateful and then I forget. So it's kind of like a discipline, a hard practice, really.
And ritual, I think actually that's something that we don't talk about enough. And I think ritual is very powerful, and you don't necessarily have to find a book on ritual. It's about doing something that's real for you, and it can be going out and getting a candle. It's your intent. Your intent is, I'm acknowledging all the sadness and sorrow, and I'm bringing some light into the darkness.
Yes.
And I'm going to sit with this. I'm going to be still with this for a period of time. It might be a minute, it might be an hour. That ritual, I think ritual was a really powerful companion in grief.
Indeed. The other thing I did as I went out, I have a veranda with a view over the town, and I watched clouds for about, not that long, maybe 20 minutes. And I didn't think wise thoughts. I just thought, look at the clouds. And I just tried to be still for a while, because distraction is another thing that you can use to keep feelings at bay. And I didn't even consciously decide. I just went out and sat down and started watching the clouds. And then today I went and got a candle, because it seemed like a good idea. Yeah.
Do you want to flash up the cover of your gorgeous book? It's a very moving.
Now, how can I do it? Is that good enough?
Yeah, of Stumbling Stones by Airdre Grant. Sorry, what's the subtitle? It's a journey through. It's a path through
grief, love, and loss.
Yeah,
and you can get it at Booktopia or online. They've all got it.
Excellent. Also, too, sometimes I was going to say where books like that can be really useful is kind of confirm that you're not alone, that other people in the world are experiencing grief. This is somebody sharing something very personal can be really useful. And I think also sometimes if you're going through, I sometimes talk to people who are grieving who say, I don't feel anything. It's sometimes
they're numb.
That numbness.
Numb with pain, yeah.
Experiencing somebody else's raw pain can actually be really therapeutic.
I received mail from all over the world, from the oddest of people and the strangest of places, about the book. But as we're about to finish, I'll tell you a wee story that happened when I was on that Scotland trip. I was way up in Scotland, and as I came back down on the borders, there's a Buddhist place called Sammy Ling that you can stay at. And I went to stay there, and a very bad-tempered monk checked me, and he looked most put out. And you stay in these little dormitories. And it was cold, so I went to the tea room, which was all decked out like a Tibetan tea room you might find in the Himalayas, and it was run by a couple of that day there were a couple of blokes there who were Buddhist, not students, I suppose. So they had shaved heads and they looked a bit like bother boys, like soccer hooligans. But anyway, they were in this beautiful, really lovely little tea room, and I said, "Would you mind? I hope you don't mind, but would you fill my hot water bottle because I'm cold?" And he said, "Aye, but I draw the line at a bedtime story." And that happened to me on that ragged trip. Every so often people would make me laugh, and it would just remind me that this is darkness, but it's like looking at a stormy sky. There'll be flashes of light. He made me laugh. I got my hottie and I went back. It was lovely.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Airdre. It's wonderful. Okay. We could talk all day, but I think we need to stop it here for today. It's been perfect.